Tongkat Ali might not take you from normal to super normal, like some other nootropics might do. But if you're below normal, this might be just the thing you need to get back up to that strong baseline where you should have been in the first place.
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 179th episode of this podcast dedicated to anything and everything that you can do to help the better workings of your brain and body. Mostly your brain, but in this episode and in some episodes, as you know, we sort of stray off topic and go below the neck. This is going to be one of those, but I'm giving myself a little bit of a free pass because this episode is actually directly addressing several questions we'd gotten on email, listener requests that we cover this compound in particular, a Southeast Asian plant best known as Tongkat Ali. You'll probably hear both me and the guest pronounce this a variety of ways over the course of the episode. Trust him, don't trust me. It's actually spelled almost just like it sounds, Tongkat. Then the next word is Ali, like Muhammad Ali. And this is a substance that's been used in traditional medicine in parts of the world where it's been available for a long time, purported to be both a male virility enhancer, so sexual stuff, and also just general physical oomph. Not surprisingly, those two go together, and it seems like the common element here is Tongkat Ali's effect on testosterone. We'll be talking with researcher Dr. Shawn Talbott in the main interview, and if you hang around until the end of the episode, I'm going to tell you something funny about the brain, literally in this case, brain differences between professionally funny people and everyone else. We're not sure which direction the causality is flowing on this one, or if there might be a common factor hidden somewhere, but either being funny changes your brain or having a certain type of brain makes you more likely to be funny. We will dig into all of that in the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick. But right now, let's kick things off, as usual, with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So we all know intuitively that when you are under stress, it can be harder to remember things. The hippocampus has been shown in various studies to have a harder time serving up memories to conscious awareness when a person has heightened cortisol levels. Cortisol is a stress-related hormone. It comes up naturally when we're under psychological stress or physical stress, and scientists can also introduce it exogenously to do tests of this nature. So cortisol up, memory retrieval down. But recently, researchers at Ruhr University Bochum were wondering about a related but opposite issue. Could the presence of cortisol, and by extension stress, inhibit the formation of new memories? Their work, as published recently in the journal Psychoneuroendocrinology, seems to imply that the answer is yes. Says studies author Dr. Hubert Dintz. We have now discovered that stress can exert a major effect on perception and perceptual learning. To conduct the study, the researchers looked at learning under the effects of something called passive finger stimulation, which is a well-known, well-understood technique where people are shown to exhibit learning without actually expending any effort on the learning. This is learning at the very low-level perceptual learning sense, learning in this case the ability to discriminate 2 points tactily on one's fingers. Tactile sensitivity, the sense of touch and how accurate that is for a person, is typically measured by gently poking a person with 2 pins. The person is blindfolded or otherwise made so they can't see the pins, and then bringing those pinpricks closer and closer together until the person can't distinguish, am I being poked with 1 pin or 2 pins? The closer together you can bring these points before it just feels like one amorphous poke, the more tactily sensitive that person is. But passive finger stimulation, believe it or not, has been shown to reliably and significantly improve a person's tactile sensitivity in their fingers. For this study, the researchers got 30 participants, some of whom were given a placebo and some of whom were given cortisol, and then all of these people experienced passive finger stimulation. Then they were given this test and measured for their 2-point discrimination threshold, and the placebo group improved as was expected, but the group that received cortisol was essentially flatlined. They showed only just the slightest smidgen of improvement, but nothing near the 15% that the others got, said cognitive psychologist Professor Oliver T. Wolf. Our data show that a single dose of cortisol not only disrupts memory in the hippocampus, but also has a substantial effect on the plasticity of sensory areas of the brain. The researchers expect that what's happening here at a cellular level is the suppression of long-term potentiation by the neurons that are affected. So keeping your brain unhampered in its ability to do perceptual learning tasks, one more reason to keep your stress level low. Negative stressors are something that we're probably all trying to avoid anyway, but these findings actually could have near-term applications in the way that some therapies are done, because a class of compounds called corticosteroids, of which cortisol is one, are often used in the treatment of immunological and neurological diseases. However, a lot of these very same diseases have treatment protocols that would involve perceptual learning. So if they're taking cortisol, they might be really undercutting their ability to correctly perform or at least to benefit from the therapy.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart we have smart in our title. Twice.
So a big thank you to everyone who entered into last month's contest for a couple of human chargers that we were giving away. If you've been listening to the recent episodes, you know that we had a leave an iTunes review, get yourself entered into a drawing going on. Got a whole lot of very nice reviews, which was hardly diminished in its heartwarmingness, knowing that there was somewhat of a bribe behind it. Sometimes it takes a little bit of a spur to get you to do something that you're probably planning to do anyways, you just hadn't gotten around to it yet. So a big thank you to everybody that entered into that contest. We put all the contest entrants into a big spreadsheet and went to random.org, a mathematically valid random number generator on the web. And as of yesterday, selected 2 winners who are, drumroll please, Andrew Kraus of Canada and Denise Peters from the Netherlands. Andrew said, Smart Drug Smarts helps to sort through the vast amounts of information about brain health and nootropics by getting straight to the source, interviewing the individuals that did the research themselves, or by combing through the data and breaking down trials on the show. And Denise said, found out about this podcast last week and have been glued to it ever since because of the quality and the interesting topics. My focus group is working on a project concerning the effect of blue light on sleep, so episode number 175 was majorly interesting for us. So a couple of international winners, kind of cool that luck of the draw determined that. Most of the entrants were from the US, but the Smart Drug Smarts diaspora is pretty wide. We'll be getting those human chargers mailed out this week, and for the rest of you who might be heartbroken that you did not win the human charger, you could still pick one up from the fine folks at Valky. We'll put a link to that up on the show notes for this episode. Other things going on in the Smart Drug Smarts universe, we've got a newsletter called The Brain Breakfast, of which we would love to make you a subscriber if you are not one already. Somebody asked me recently where we do the research to come up with the stories that we cover on Smart Drug Smarts. There's a wide variety of answers to that one, and a lot of them are increasingly coming from listeners saying, hey, Jesse, you got to check out this. But you can also find some helpful cheat sheets as to the publications that we're reading in the footer of the Smart Drug Smarts newsletter, where we'll often have stuff that we found cool that didn't make it onto the show or just hasn't made it onto the show yet. You can sign up for the Brain Breakfast at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. Also, fun little fact, May 6th is apparently Herb Day. Herbs have their very own holiday. This did not have anything to do with Tongkat Ali being picked as the topic for this episode, the fact that there is a tangentially related holiday, but it doesn't hurt either. Tongkat Ali would qualify as an herb. I wasn't exactly sure what the dictionary definition of herb was, so I looked it up. Turns out that an herb is a plant or a plant part valued for its medicinal, savory, or aromatic qualities. That's insofar as it relates to humans, or if you're more of the botanist type, it is a seed-producing annual, biennial, or perennial plant that does not develop persistent woody tissue, but instead dies at the end of a growing season. And finally, the third definition is a slang term for marijuana. Should you be looking to celebrate Herb Day in pill form with a pill that is legal just about everywhere, it would be remiss of me not to point out that pycnogenol, which is derived from the bark of a tree that grows in the south of France, does qualify as an herb under that definition, and pycnogenol is one of the 4 ingredients that can be found in Nexus. Yeah, that might have been a bit of a stretch to remind you about Axon Labs, but I will do it anyway. AxonLabs.io is the retail end of goings-on over here at Smart Drug Smarts, where we've got 2 supplement stacks, Nexus and Mitogen, Nexus being our cognitive stack and the one with pycnogenol in it, and Mitogen, as the name implies, a mitochondrial support stack. Both of those you can find over at AxonLabs.io.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So what we're going to be calling Tongkat Ali in this episode is scientifically known as Eurychema longifolia and also as Malaysian Ginseng. So it goes by a variety of names, but in parts of the world where it's known, it's considered to be an anti-aging remedy and is touted as having uses from improving libido and energy levels to sports performance and weight loss. So a pretty wide variety of things on its chemical resume. In the coming interview, I'm going to be talking with Dr. Shawn Talbott, who is the lead author of a study published in the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition, titled appropriately, The Effect of Tongkat Ali on Stress Hormones and Psychological Mood State in Moderately Stressed Subjects. We'll be talking both about that study and the overall literature on Tongkat Ali, what it's thought to do and not do. So let's jump in now talking Eurychema longifolia, better known as Tongkat Ali, with Dr. Shawn Talbott.
Tongkat Ali was used traditionally as a tonic, probably the stereotypical use of Tongkat Ali back in the day, and even to this day, when it's used by the people of Malaysia, is as a tonic for an older man. Older man is a little bit tired, a little bit fatigued, a little bit low in the libido department. You get some Tongkat Ali root, and you either shave it into your tea, or you boil it, or you put it into a soup, as a traditional way to do it. So you're doing an extraction, so to speak. You're doing a hot hot water extraction if you're making it into a tea. And what you get from that is libido comes back, energy comes back, mental focus and acuity comes back. In my research, I measure something called vigor. Psychological vigor is part energy, part mental focus, part well-being. And that's what you get from a traditional usage of Malaysian Ginseng or Tongkat Ali, or what we call uricoma. Its Latin name is Uricoma longifolia.
And are the results that people see from Tongkat Ali something that comes on in an acute spike a few minutes or hours after they take it? Or is it something that builds up in your system over a period of time as a nutrient?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, because it's kind of a two-phase effect. So you can get more of a mental energy effect from Tongkat Ali within 30 to 60 minutes of taking it, right? So that tells us that there's something going on, maybe neurotransmitter-wise in the brain. Maybe something is happening with the gut microbiome. That sort of acute effect that you're feeling within an hour or so, it's unlikely that it's hormonal. It's unlikely that it's doing anything through sort of the endocrine system. But there's a secondary effect that does come on after several weeks of usage, and that is more of an endocrinological effect where you're getting a change in cortisol, stress hormone is coming down, testosterones are coming up, and I'll put a big asterisk on that. As soon as people hear me say that I'm raising their testosterone, if you're a guy, you're getting all excited, especially if you're an athlete.
Right.
And if you're a woman, you're getting all worried, right? But what we found, and I think this is interesting because I think it supports how the herb is used traditionally, but it doesn't necessarily support the modern usage of it in some of the sports supplements. And that what we found is that if you had low testosterone or suboptimal testosterone levels, we were able to raise those back up into what we might consider a more normal, more optimal range, but we weren't increasing it above that. And that, I think, is an important distinction for people who are maybe looking at something like Tongkat Ali and saying, maybe that'll increase my performance. Maybe yes, maybe no, depending on where you're starting from.
Gotcha. So there is sort of a natural ceiling to it.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to why people should consider adaptogens in the first place, in that they really are these herbs that help to either maintain balance or rebalance you if you're out of balance, versus taking something to take you from your normal baseline to a higher baseline. And this might not be that. Like a Tongkat Ali might not take you from normal to super normal, like some other nootropics might do.
Yeah.
But if you're below normal or you're suboptimal, this might be just the thing you need to get back up to that strong baseline where you should have been in the first place.
Yeah, that's one of those continuing themes that we try to keep coming back to, is getting yourself to your physiological baseline the natural way if possible, before layering in the exotic new pharmaceuticals, technologies, kind of icing on the cake stuff.
I'm sure you run into this all the time, is that, you get people who are not eating right, not sleeping enough, they're under a lot of stress, they're putting all these things on top of themselves so that, in effect, they're going through life at this suboptimal balance point. They're suppressed in a lot of ways. And if they would just do the things that we know they're supposed to do, control their stress, get more sleep, exercise more regularly, eat a better diet, they're going to be at a better level anyway. And then from there, maybe the sky's the limit, but let's at least get you back to where you're supposed to be before you start doing all kinds of self-prescribing.
What are some of the things we know about the mechanism of action for Tongkat Ali?
Yeah, so we think the way it works. So in the clinical trial that we did it because some of my clients, nutraceutical companies that wanted to formulate with this, were looking at it as a testosterone booster. Could we put this in a sports product and market it to young athletic males as something that's going to increase their testosterone? Because sometimes companies will market it as like an herbal Viagra or, an herbal sexual enhancement kind of a thing. And so the other side of that is to come into sports and say, well, if it boosts your testosterone, that's going to be good for your muscles. And so we came at this in a very skeptical way to say, look, it probably isn't going to increase testosterone. The way that it's structured, it just doesn't seem like it should have that sort of a mechanism in the body. So we did a trial, and what we found was what I explained before. It didn't increase testosterone from normal to above normal, but it did take it from low normal back up to mid-range normal. And we think that what's happening there is not that it's increasing total testosterone. We actually did not find that. There was no increase in overall testosterone synthesis or secretion, but there was a higher level of free testosterone. And so one of the things that can happen in certain kinds of stress is your body still has testosterone, but it's not a bioavailable form. And so Tongkat Ali, its main effectiveness might be that it takes that testosterone that's there and makes it more bioavailable so that you're able to use a higher percentage of what you already have on board.
Where is the testosterone bound up in the body when it's not freely available? I mean, the fact that there is free testosterone implies that there must be non-free testosterone somewhere. What's going on there exactly?
Yeah, so it has to be free testosterone for your body to use it. So in total testosterone, it's not a bioavailable source. The way we get to that is that we measure in our studies, we measure salivary testosterone. Salivary testosterone is free testosterone. So you're not getting into, well, am I measuring total? Am I measuring free? What percentages are those? What we're measuring in our studies is 100% free testosterone because we're measuring salivary testosterone.
Did the changes that you saw bringing people up towards that baseline, was that age dependent in any way? Did you test both older men for whom a lower level of testosterone might be normal and also younger men who are running at a conspicuously low level of testosterone for their age?
No, and that'd be interesting to do because we wanted to not only look at the potential hormonal changes, but we also wanted to look at mood state changes. So we looked at subjects that were moderately stressed and we split it between men and women. So we had males and females here. You know, when we talk about testosterone, I think people default automatically and they think that testosterone is a man's hormone and that's the only ones who should be concerned about it. But women have plenty of testosterone, 10 times less than a male's body will. But it's even more important for a female to keep her testosterone in that normal range because when her testosterone drops below normal, there's so little of it, it's much more noticeable that she'll get some of the common side effects like fatigue and depression and brain fog and abdominal fat and those sort of things. So we wanted to look at both men and women. And what we found was there wasn't the same magnitude of change, but there was the same percentage change, which again points to, hey, this isn't something that's changing synthesis. It's probably changing the bioavailability of this hormone that's already been manufactured in the body. So we looked at men and women. We looked across a wide age range. You would say middle-age people. And we looked at people who had moderate stress, which is known to increase cortisol and suppress testosterone.
And it's also just about everybody in the world these days.
And that's one of the other things is that it makes it more representative of the people who might want to look at a supplement like this. Going into the study, what we thought was if this is going to work and we see any of these hormonal changes and we look at how people feel when they take this traditionally, we expected we would see changes in things like vigor. Vigor would go up and burnout would go down. We thought we would see changes in fatigue levels. We thought we'd see changes in depression levels. And we actually didn't see any significant change in depression. We didn't see any significant change in vigor or fatigue, but we did see changes in other mood states. So in the Tongkat Ali group, tension went down. So people were calmer, which was interesting to see. And that could have been related to the cortisol suppression. Anger went down, which was really interesting. And a lot of people have asked me questions about that saying, well, wait a minute. If testosterone is going up, even though it was free that was going up, shouldn't people be more angry? Isn't that like an anger thing? And they're thinking like roid rage kinds of questions, but it didn't. Anger went down. Irritability would be another way of describing what anger is in the mood state parameters that we look at. And confusion went down, which makes perfect sense because if your cortisol's up and your testosterone is down, you generally have more brain fog when you're stressed out. And so people seem to be clearer headed with this, which is kind of a neat story overall. You're chronically stressed, your cortisol goes up, your testosterone goes down. We can give you Tongkat Ali, and I can't remember if we did 4 weeks or 8 weeks in this particular trial. So we see that cortisols come down to normal, from high to down to normal. Testosterones come from low back up to normal. So hormones are normalizing. And then we see a very nice correlation between those hormones and the mood state parameters. So you can't necessarily sit there and say, oh, my cortisol feels lower today. But you can say to yourself, do I feel calm? Do I feel stressed? Do I feel clear-headed or foggy or those sorts of things? And so the mood state parameters and the hormone parameters tracked really nicely with each other.
Something like cortisol varies day in, day out based on diurnal rhythms, among other things. So the changes that you're seeing as you're tracking cortisol levels over the course of 8 weeks, how is that being measured? Are you measuring it multiple times per day or at the same time of day for a given person each day?
Yeah, so generally in the kinds of studies that we do, we'll measure it 2 ways. If we're doing circadian rhythms and we're looking for a pattern of cortisol, we'll measure it 4 times a day. Immediately on waking, 10 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 8 o'clock at night. Usually usually 4 time points so that you can get a curve. And what we see there with something like Tongkat Ali is we'll see that cortisol rhythm can get restored, similar to how several adaptogens will do that. What a lot of people will get when they're under chronic stress isn't so much that their cortisol is high, but that their cortisol rhythm is flattened. What you end up seeing is that their morning cortisol, when it should be high, is low. And so that person feels fatigued. They feel like they can't get out of bed. And then that same person, when you look at their nighttime cortisol is high when it should be low. And that person feels restless and tense and they can't relax. And so it's not high when it's supposed to be high and it's not low when it's supposed to be low. It's flat. I mean, literally, the line is flat across those 4 time points. And that person just feels terrible. And so something like Tongkat Ali or cordyceps or rhodiola or some of the ginsengs can restore that rhythm so that you're not really changing overall cortisol exposure, but you're changing when the cortisol exposure hits. We also can sometimes measure it depending on the design of the study. If we don't have the opportunity to measure it 4 times throughout the day, we can just do once, and that one time is a morning first wakening cortisol. So we'll basically have the subjects take a little saliva tube, put it on their bathroom counter or on their nightstand, and as soon as they wake up in the morning, they're spitting into that tube. And that morning cortisol is very representative of what their cortisol reactivity is going to look like through the rest of the day.
Do the parameters that you're tracking, things like mood over the course of these 8 weeks, is that a self-reported test that people are doing, or is there something more numerical or analytical? I'm also wondering about things like brain fog, if this is just based on a self-report or doing time tests or something like that.
Yeah, no. So we use a lot of validated psychological mood state questionnaires. The one that we use is called the Profile of Mood States, POMS or POMS. That one's been used in 3,000 or 4,000 different clinical trials to really get a quantitative and a qualitative validated view on what somebody is feeling like. I see all kinds of studies that will do exactly what you just described, asking people, do you have more energy? How do you feel? That's interesting. Every piece of information is good information, but using something like the POMS, it's validated, it's quantifiable, it's trackable over time. The one thing that it does suffer from is that the intervals that you can take something like that has to be 2 weeks or longer. So you couldn't give somebody a profile of mood states today and then give it 2 hours later or tomorrow. It just doesn't work that way. It really is more of a long-term index of what their mood is doing in several different parameters. There are other ones too. There are quality of life indices that are more 4 weeks to 8 weeks in duration. So yeah, we can quantify how somebody is feeling over time pretty reproducibly.
And what were the population sizes like that you were putting in through these studies?
This one that we've been talking about, there were probably 60 or so subjects that we went through. So not a huge study, but the fact that we're seeing pretty good statistical significance on most of these parameters tells us that the magnitude changes that we're seeing are pretty substantial. And the consistency that we're seeing of the 30 subjects who got Tongkat Ali, it's not like 2 are getting a huge effect and the rest are getting no effect. There seems to be a pretty good consistency. Given that, let me qualify it by saying, in a certain sense, our subjects were tailor recruited to have an effect. They were moderately stressed. These would be the kinds of people who would get a traditional preparation of Tongkat Ali if they were living in Malaysia and went to a traditional therapist.
Yeah.
So from that standpoint, you look at that. Can you now take those data and transfer it to a 25-year-old weightlifter who's trying to get ripped? I wouldn't necessarily think that that would be the right use of the data.
So in the traditional uses, it sounds like there's probably a lot of different potential preparations. Sometimes this might be a drink, it might be a topical treatment. The types of studies that have been shown to have efficacy, what are some of the commonalities? Like if somebody's looking for a Tongkat Ali preparation, what might that look like?
What I tell people is to look for a water extract. Even though we come at it from the perspective of science and say, okay, what mechanism do you think we're seeing here? What do the rodent studies say? What can we standardize this extract to? I do always like to go back to traditional usage. And the easiest way to look at traditional preparations is to say, all right, is this root traditionally a water extract? Are they making tea out of it? Or is this an alcohol extract? Are they putting it in a jar with ethanol, rum, or something like that to extract those bioactives? Because that's a really important distinction, because the water is going to extract different bioactive compounds than the alcohol is. And so traditionally, Tongkat Tongkat Ali is a tea. So it's a water extract. And there have been some studies, and I'm not an analytical chemist, I've read these studies before, to show that if you extract that Tongkat Ali root with alcohol versus water, you get a vastly different profile of bioactives. And I'm not sure that doing an alcohol extract is the way to go, because we've got hundreds or thousands of years of usage in Malaysian traditional medicine using hot water extract. So what I'll tell people is if they're going to look for Tongkat Ali supplement, the supplement is probably going to say on it hot water extract. And that I think is probably the way to go because we know the most about it. That's what we used in our study. And so I can't speak to an alcohol extract of is that better or worse. I know it's different.
And what should people be looking at dosage-wise with Tongkat Ali? I know one of the nice things with adaptogens is that they're sort of self-regulating, and there's not necessarily a hard and dangerous ceiling like there are with some other compounds. But nevertheless, what's a target dose that would be good to aim for?
We use 200 milligrams a day for 4 weeks of a hot water extract. And I know there's a couple of companies that make a hot water extract, 3 that I know of at least, that supply it to a lot of different finished product manufacturers. I would say to somebody, if you're interested in this, look for 200 milligrams, look for hot water extract. I don't know if you're going to find Tongkat Ali by itself out there. Maybe you will, but I would suspect that most formulators are going to say, all right, so we can get this effect with Tongkat Ali. What else am I going to combine it with? Am I going to combine it with XYZ ingredients so I have my proprietary blend or something like that? That's where I would expect to see it most often.
For somebody that's looking to put a stack together and Tongkat Ali is something that they're interested in, does that get rid of the need for something else that might be in their medicine cabinet already, something that might then be duplicative and they just don't need anymore?
I'll tell you who I recommend Tongkat Ali to most often these days is athletes, even like me. I'm turned 50 later on this year. I still exercise pretty hard. I do ultra running and long distance triathlons and things like that. And when I'm training my hardest, my cortisol testosterone balance is definitely at risk. So I'll take Tongkat Ali in that sort of a situation to try to keep my testosterone in the normal range, keep it from dropping. So that's what I'll recommend it in that sort of a situation as kind of a first step. I'll also recommend it to people who are thinking, I need to get my testosterone levels up. Somebody might think that their testosterone is low for whatever reason. So I'll say to them, try Tongkat Ali first, see if your problem is actually that you need more free testosterone, see if that's going to get you to where you need to be. Then if not, if that doesn't do it for you, then there's other options. Like you can go to a DHEA that's going to actually be the building block for you to make more testosterone. You'll see if that is kind of the issue. So, and you may differ with this, do you stack automatically or do you stack sequentially? I'm more of a sequential stacker. You try product A, see what you get with that, then add product B, then add product C, instead of starting with a blend of A, B, C.
It seems like there's so much individual variability as far as what a given person is going to respond to, that if you add everything in the kitchen sink all at once, even if you do get a result, you're not going to know what the result's actually coming from.
Right, exactly.
Are there any real gotchas, things that people should know or that just might catch people by surprise that you wouldn't suspect?
Maybe one that we touched on that I think is maybe important to emphasize is the female angle, whether it's women who are training hard, women who are under stress, or if it's women who low libido, low sex drive, or are considering bioidentical hormones or something like that. This might chance for them to say, all right, I'm going to take this traditional herb. I don't have to be afraid of it boosting my testosterone level like I'm taking a steroid or something like that. And it might get me up to that level where, hey, I feel like my young self again. If there's one label I could put on this, it's really has some, quote, anti-aging effects in terms of hormones normalize a little bit and you feel younger in certain ways. So, I would maybe say that women should look at it, even though it's a, quote unquote, testosterone herb.
Have you seen any negative effects from it? Anybody that has an adverse reaction?
I haven't. People will sometimes say that it gives them heartburn if they take it on an empty stomach. So my solution there as a nutritionist is to tell them to take it with a meal. But I've never heard of any allergic reactions or haven't seen anything with liver enzymes or renal function or anything like that have changed, even at pretty high doses. We only use 200 milligrams in ours, but I know that sometimes there's recommendations for 600 or 800 milligrams, but I haven't really seen any problems with that either.
Is there any addictive potential for Tongkat Ali? Is that something that's been seen or talked about?
I don't think it has that sort of an effect at all. I think you'll feel better on it if it's rebalancing you in the ways that we've just discussed, but I don't think there's an addictive or a stimulant or any of that kind of an effect going on here.
Do people seem to build up a tolerance? Is this something where you need to cycle on or off every now and then to make sure that it kind of maintains its oomph?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's always really hard to answer, whether it's Tongkat Ali or whether it's any adaptogens in general, because in a certain sense, you should only be taking adaptogens when you need them, right? When your stress is high or when your fatigue is high or when your energy is low or whatever. There's one school of thought that adaptogens are temporary usage. You take them during the time of the high stress, and then when the stress goes away or the stress normalizes, you taper off of them. And I kind of look at that as someone who studies stress, and I agree with that, but I also look at the kind of stress that most people are under, the stress of sleep deprivation and the stress of families and the stress of modern living and the stress of poor diets. And I look at it and say, like, when is that stress going to come down to a level where you want to go off of this adaptogen? So I'm more of a chronic usage adaptogen kind of a person than a cycling on and off, but I think that's open for debate. In psychology research, vigor is the opposite of burnout. If we have a lot of people who have high burnout or low vigor, they don't feel very good. They're fatigued, and so they reach for a Red Bull. They can't concentrate, and so they think they need Ritalin or Adderall, or they're depressed. Their doctor tells them Prozac or Zoloft or something like that, right? And I'm not an anti-pharmaceutical kind of person by any stretch, but I'm trained as a nutritionist. And so what I'd rather do is say to people, all right, what can we do with nutrition or herbals or lifestyle where we can get you out of that state of burnout and back to a state of vigor? You cover all aspects of this with nootropics, and there's a zillion ways to skin that cat, but adaptogens is one of the areas that I come back to. So I've done studies on cordyceps and rhodiola, eleuthero, ashwagandha, et cetera, et cetera. I like to throw a lot of things into the adaptogen basket because they're helping you become more stress resilient through the immune system typically, but still the outcome is that you're more able to withstand whatever stressors you're under.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very much to Dr. Shawn Talbott for having taken the time to talk Tongkat Ali with us. A pretty interesting compound, and not one you typically hear when people are bandying about the names of different adaptogens, but I think it probably deserves to be grouped in that category given what he described. Something that helps to regulate the body's physiology and nudge it back towards its proper parameters. Sounds like the overall scorecard is that this is not going to be something that's going to turn you into a testosterone beast. Advertising trying to imply that is not really being true to the science, but if you're on the lower end of the testosterone bell-shaped curve and you're trying to bring yourself up towards a more normal baseline, it could be helpful. If you've watched TV in the last 15 years, you're well aware that there's plenty of testosterone tests available and plenty of pharmaceutical companies eager to sell you stuff to deal with low testosterone. For the blood tests, as he mentioned, there's a difference between total testosterone and free testosterone. Free testosterone is probably the more useful number to know, although typically doctors want to test for total testosterone first. As Dr. Talbott mentioned, testosterone levels fluctuate during the day, and the best time to get a true reading is apparently first thing in the morning. According to the Endocrine Society, 300 nanograms per deciliter is the lower limit of normal. So if you're below that as an adult male, you might want to take notice. Totally different numbers for women, as you might imagine. But now, moving from libidinous leaves to funny bones within the brain, let's scoot ahead to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So one of the undoubted high points of being in a major metropolitan area is that you've oftentimes got sort of best of breeds in various professional spheres right next to one another geographically. So you've got the chance to rub elbows and mix ideas. And neuroscience researchers at USC in Los Angeles are taking good advantage of this in a recent study where they were looking at a well-known comedy troupe called the Groundlings, alongside other people who are not professionally funny, acting as a control group, and seeing how professional comics differ from everyone else in the creation of humor. Now, technically, this wasn't a study that was bent on cracking the code of humor so much as it was cracking creativity. But creativity, as you might imagine, is sort of a tough thing to judge, subject to dispute, which is never a good thing in a scientific study. But comedic creativity gave the researchers a pass-fail system on which they could judge whether something was successfully creative. Said the study's lead author, Irving Biederman, humor is an outstanding test bed for studying creativity. It has a clear beginning, middle, and an end, with a duration brief enough for neuroimaging. And the end product is easy to evaluate. Does it make you laugh? So in this study, both professional and amateur comedians, as well as non-comedian controls, looked at cartoons from the New Yorker magazine without words and were asked to come up with two captions for them, one of which was funny and one of which was mundane. As you might imagine, they had their brain scanned as they did this, and then a second panel of participants rated the captions that were meant to be funny to see how funny they actually were. There were two portions of the brain that were clearly involved in trying to come up with something funny. One was the medial prefrontal cortex, and the other was the temporal association region. However, the level of activity in these two areas varied depending on how experienced a person was with coming up with jokes, said USC doctoral student Ori Amir. What we found is that the more experienced someone is at doing comedy, the more activation we saw in the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is involved in both comprehending speech and also visual cognition, and it also seems to be the point where abstract information, semantic information, and remote associations converge. Now, in contrast, the amateur comedians and the non-comedians relied more heavily on their prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is oftentimes thought as the thinking part of the brain, where a lot of executive functions go on, like planning complex behaviors. So it seems like the less experienced joke creators were kind of trying to muscle their way through the situation, thinking, okay, how can I make this funny? Whereas the professionally funny people were more free associating, letting lots of different ideas come together and selecting the funny ones from what cropped up, said Amir. The more experience you have doing comedy, the less you need to engage in the top-down control and the more that you rely on spontaneous associations. The panel of people who judged the funniness of the resulting comics, they also gave higher ratings for comedy to the people that were showing higher activity in the temporal regions of their brain during the fMRI scanning. This study adds in an interesting way to Biederman's previous research work, which looks at what happens within the brain when somebody makes visual recognitions of high-level objects. That's a giraffe, that kind of thing. Or even more so, that's a giraffe and aren't giraffes cool? Here's how I feel about giraffes. And it turns out that the temporal lobe regions that show high activation from humor are also the same as those are triggered by appreciation of visual aesthetics. Like, hey, I really appreciate the look of that giraffe has something in common with, hey, I appreciate that piece of humor that I just figured out. Biederman points out that another commonality of these sorts of experiences are that they have really diminishing returns for us when we're re-stimulated in the same way. The same joke told 2 or 3 times is really only funny the first time, and looking at something that you've seen before, despite however beautiful or intriguing it might be, it can lose its luster. Biederman says that in at least this one way, humans seem to be hardwired to crave new information and experiences.
Smart Drug Smarts, where we turn information into sound, into bits, into packet data that turns back into bits and sound, and then into neurotransmitters that release funds that release mail-order synthetic chemicals that cross the blood-brain barrier to release augmented performance from your brain.
Okay, so you heard it. That is all for episode number 179. Thank you for hanging around until the end. If you enjoyed this episode, you will find the links to everything that we discussed here up at smartdrugsmarts.com/179. You have long ago figured out our naming conventions on the website, I'm sure, but last week's episode is /178, in which I spoke with doctors Rob Reiner and Eva Zisk about their uses of virtual reality technologies in dealing with psychological issues. A little bit of research, a little bit of practice there. And next week, we got a couple of contenders in the grab bag. Got a really interesting episode that we're putting together about the opiate crisis in America and elsewhere. Not sure if that'll make it for 180 or not. It might still be a couple episodes from now, so you'll have to check back and see. But one way or another, catch you back here next Friday. Same time, same podcast, and with that same unwavering damn the torpedoes enthusiasm for helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.